Today's daf is Kuf Lamed Hey. We are starting on Kuf Lamed Dalet Amud Bet at the very bottom, last line. It said Safek Vandroginos. If you have a person who has a Safek, a doubt, either this is a doubt as to whether the child is viable or not, based on how developed the child was, how many months of gestation it had, or it means it's a Safek whether it was actually born on Shabbat or not. In which case we have a doubt whether we can do the Brit Milah on Shabbat or not. Okay, or androgynos is somebody who has both male and female genitalia. So Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, or lato, it says his foreskin, or lato vadai dochet Shabbat, velo safek dochet Shabbat. That if he has a definite if he has a definite foreskin, that overrides Shabbat. If he doesn't have a definite foreskin, that doesn't override Shabbat. So, in other words, what it means to say is when there's an obligation, a definite obligation to do Brit Milah on the 8th day, so that's when you override Shabbat. If it's not a definite obligation, then you do not. Okay? So, Vadai dochet Shabbat, v'lo androgynos dochet Shabbat. Similarly, a definite case of need for Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, but androgynos does not override Shabbat. In other words, one who is both male and female, is hermaphrodite, it doesn't, his Brit Milah, or whatever, his or her Brit Milah does not override Shabbat in that case.
That's what Yehuda said.
This is what the Tanna Kama says. Rabbi Yehuda Omer androgynos dochet Shabbat v'anush karet. Okay, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, androgynos actually, because he has the genitalia that require Brit Milah, he requires a Brit Milah, that's it. So even though he also has female parts, that doesn't exempt him from Brit Milah, according to Rabbi Yehuda. According to the Chachamim, it does. So you'll look at Rashi on the top, he says, Safeku, that androgynos, according to the Chachamim, is a safek. We're not sure what the status is. So therefore we do a Brit Milah, but we don't override Shabbat to do the Brit Milah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's a definite. He has the obligation.
The safek is whether you are obligated or not.
Right. So it would be whether you're obligated or not. So therefore we would do the Brit Milah according to the Chachamim, but we wouldn't do it on Shabbat because we were in doubt whether it's necessary or not. Okay, so now we said, or latov vaday dochet Shabbat v'lo nolad ben hashemashot dochet Shabbat. So similarly, or that if the person was definitely born on Shabbat, then their Brit Milah will override Shabbat, but not if they were born in ben hashemashot. Ben hashemashot means they were born at a time where we're not sure whether the person was born on the day that, in other words, if you're born on Shabbat, that's when you have your Brit Milah on Shabbat. If you were born on Friday, you would have your Brit Milah on Friday. So if it's Friday after sunset, but it's not yet nighttime, we're not really sure if you're born on Shabbat or not, so we can't do the Brit Milah on Shabbat. Similarly on Saturday, if the person was born right after sunset, but not Tzet Kochavim, the stars haven't come out yet, so we're not really exactly sure whether he was born on Shabbat or he was born on Sunday. So we can't do the Brit Milah on Shabbat.
And the reason is because that even if it was in Shabbat, you would not know for sure that you're actually doing the Brit Milah at the right time.
Exactly. Or if you're past the time. In other words, you could be past the time. Or you could be before the time.
No, but if you're past it and you know you're past
in other words, if it's Friday, if he was really born on Friday, it's really the 9th day and you're doing the Brit Milah on Shabbat, which you can't do. You can only do the Brit Milah on Shabbat when it's the 8th day.
But it's only when there's a safek.
Right, only a safek. Right. Now, so that's what he says. Or latov vaday dochet Shabbat v'lo nolad kishu mahul dochet Shabbat. Similarly, only one who has a definite a definite foreskin overrides Shabbat. But nolad mahul, if you're born without a foreskin, you're born circumcised. Nolad mahul, then even though we do hatafat dam berit, let's say we draw blood from the person, still it doesn't override Shabbat. So Shabbat Shammai Omrim.
That's not an obligation. In other words,
well, that's what we're going to get into now. So Shabbat Shammai Omrim tzarich latif mimeno dam berit, uBeit Hillel Omrim eno tzarich. According to Beit Shammai, you have to do hatafat dam berit if someone is born circumcised. According to Beit Hillel, you don't have to do it. But even according to Beit Shammai, who says you have to do it, you don't do it on Shabbat. Okay? So that's what the
implication of that is that if it wasn't Shabbat and you didn't do it, you're not chayv karet.
That's so far. Except according to Beit Shammai. According to Beit Shammai, you have to do it.
Right.
But even according to Beit Shammai, it must be a safek because he's saying that you wouldn't do it on Shabbat. So it's not a definite. Now, before when we said a safek, another type of safek is that they, according to the rabbis of the time, if a child was 7 months or 9 months, it was viable. But if it was an 8-month baby, gestation, in other words, if the pregnancy was 8 months, the baby wouldn't survive. So a baby born at 8 months, they wouldn't do a Brit Milah because they said he's going to die, he's not going to live. We're going to see more about that in a minute. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, "Lo nechluku beit Shammai beit Hillel no latkishu mahul shetzarich latif mimeno dam berit." It's not true. Nobody says that you don't have to do hatafat dam berit for a baby that was born circumcised. Everybody agrees that you do because it has an orla kivusha, a sunken in foreskin. In other words, we assume that it does have something, but that it's somehow melded in with the body of the penis itself, rather than being separate and distinct. Okay? In fact, what's the machloket according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? According to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, a child that's born circumcised, you definitely have to do hatafat dam brit. The question is, a non-Jew who did a circumcision. In other words, a child who was born, he never had anything because he was born without a foreskin, right, without a discernible foreskin, and he never had anything. So that child, everybody agrees you have to do something. You draw some blood, hatafat dam brit. But a convert who comes, he had a brit. Right. Let's say he was circumcised for some other reason, medical reasons, whatever. So he had something. Right, so there, Beit Shammai says he still needs hatafat dam brit, even though he had an actual circumcision, and Beit Hillel says no, he doesn't need it. Now the halacha happens to be that in both cases we require it, both for a child born circumcised and for a convert who was already circumcised. But there's a machloket here.
I mean, what would clarify this is whether the obligation is on the act itself
or the state, right? The condition, exactly. That's really what the issue is here. Now, so Amar the master said that. Amar, the master said, a doubtful case doesn't override Shabbat. So what is this coming to include? It's coming to include what the rabbis taught. Ben shiv'a mechalelin alav et Shabbat, uben chet en mechalelin alav et Shabbat. Safek ben zayin, safek ben chet en mechalelin alav et Shabbat. That ben shimona harehu ke'even vasur letaltelo. So what it says is that if a child was 7 months gestation period and was born mechalelin alav et Shabbat, then we desecrate Shabbat to do his brit milah and etc. And if he's ben chet, if he's an 8-month child, he was born after 8 months of gestation, we don't violate Shabbat to do his brit milah. If he's a question whether it's 7th or 8th month, again, we don't violate Shabbat because we're not sure. Because if he's an 8-month baby, then this brit milah is a waste of time, according to the Chachamim. Okay, so ben shmona harehu ka'even. In fact, an 8-month a baby that only gestated for 8 months is like a rock. We don't even consider. We don't do anything for it. V'asur letaltelo is muktzeh on Shabbat because they assumed that it wasn't a viable child. It was like the child was dead. However, the mother can bend and nurse the child in order to take the milk out of her, because otherwise she'll get engorged, and she'll have a lot of pain and suffering. But basically, they consider this child to be not viable at all. Now, obviously, today we have a different view, and even 6-month gestation or less, they can save the child. So we save the child.
Because, if the baby is alive, he's either alive or he's dead.
I know, it's very interesting. Well, the only time they really applied this halacha was when they were absolutely sure that it was exactly 8 months. Otherwise, they would be, they would err on the side of caution. But it's really interesting that they assumed that even though there's a living baby, it's not going to live. Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, so Itmar was stated. Rav Amar halacha ketanakama. Rav says the halacha follows the Tanakama that we read before. Okay, and the Tanakama was that if you go back, that we had said before that according to the Tanakama, according to Beit Hillel, a nolad mahul doesn't need a brit milah. Right? Somebody who's born circumcised does not require a brit milah according to Beit Hillel, according to the first version. Ushmuel amar halacha Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and Shmuel says no, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, everybody agrees a nolad mahul, somebody who's born circumcised, does require a brit milah. Both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai assume that, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar.
The next question is, does it require bisma now or not?
Well, that's going to come up now. Okay, so the first issue is, does the child born circumcised require a brit milah at all? So the first version was, well, according to Beit Hillel, no. That's what Rav is saying. Shmuel is saying no. We go like the second version that said that Beit Hillel says yes. Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai both say yes. Rav Ada bar Ahava itiled lehahu yanuka kishu mahul. Rav Ada bar Ahava had a child that was nolad mahul. It was born circumcised. Now, this is a sad story. What ended up happening was that this baby was born on Shabbat, so its Brit Milah was scheduled to take place on Shabbat. And according to Rav Ada bar Ahava, he was following the principle of Shmuel, that this baby required Hatafat Dam Brit, because even though it was born mahol, and that it's required bizmano. He assumed that it was required on the day. So therefore, since the baby was born on Shabbat, they needed to do hatafat dam brit on Shabbat. So he went to 13 mohalim, which Rashi says whenever it says 13, it's an exaggeration. It means he went to everyone he could find. Nobody would do it on Shabbat. They all said it's not required, and therefore I cannot do this on Shabbat. It's not allowed to be done on Shabbat. So what ended up happening was Rav Ada bar Ahava decided to take the law into his own hands and to circumcise the child on his own. And he circumcised the child on his own, and he ended up wounding the child irrevocably. He made him a kirut shofcha, which means he made him basically, I don't know if it would be castrated, but he cut the organ in such a way that he was impotent. Basically, the child was no longer able to function normally in that area. So it caused him irreparable damage. And he said, Amar titili ta'avri ad Rav. This must have happened to me because I violated Rav. Because what did Rav say? Rav was the one who said that he doesn't require any hatafat dam brit at all. I should have just followed Rav. And because I violated the rule of Rav, and normally we say halacha kirav bi'isurei. The law usually follows Rav in ritual matters. Halacha kishmuel b'dinei. The law follows Shmuel in civil matters. So it should have followed Rav here. So I should have followed him, and I shouldn't have done anything. So Amar le Rav Nachman said to him, Ve'ad Shmuel lo avar? You didn't violate the rule of Shmuel too? Amar Shmuel b'chol, b'Shabbat mi amar? Shmuel only said you had to do hatafat dam brit on the weekday. He never said you could override Shabbat to do the dam brit. Even he says that it's only a safek. Even he says it's only a safek. So, in other words, there are two views of Beit Hillel here. Either Beit Hillel says you have to do it mi safek, you have to do it out of doubt, in which case you certainly can't violate Shabbat for that. Or, according to Rav, you don't have to do it at all. But nobody says you can do it on Shabbat. That's not even an issue, not even a possibility. So, what did Rav Ada bar Ahava think? Hu savar vadai or lakivushahi. According to Rav Ada bar Ahava's understanding of Shmuel was that it's a definite requirement. That when he said that Beit Hillel says you need to do hatafat dam brit, he meant for sure. There's definitely some kind of orla, some kind of a foreskin embedded there. So he thought it was a definite. So you should do it on Shabbat too. Why shouldn't you do it on Shabbat? So the Itmar.
That he said it still makes it a safek because it's one opinion.
Well, but it was his own opinion. In other words, Rav Ada bar Ahava himself, that's what he thought.
Right. Okay.
That's how he interpreted Shmuel, and he thought that he was saying. In other words, that's how he interpreted Shmuel, and that's why he thought it was a definite and was trying to do it on Shabbat. Right, he didn't think it was a safek. He thought that we're following Shmuel. Shmuel says definite. So what happens? So the Itmar, we had a discussion about this because Rabba Amar Chayshinan Shema or Lakivushahi, Rav Yosef Amar Vadai or Lakivushahi. This is a machlok between Rabba and Rav Yosef. Rabba said Chayshinan. We're concerned maybe there is an embedded foreskin. Rav Yosef said, Vadai or lakivushahi. It's definitely an or lakivushahi. We know that Rabban and Rav Yosef were contemporaries, and they both had the opportunity to be the head of the yeshiva, the head of the main yeshiva. So they were, these two Rashi yeshiva, the two Gidolim, basically, of the time, had a machloket about this. Is it a safek, or is it a definite? So Rav Yosef says it's definite. Now he's going to try to prove it. And that was what Rav Ada bar Ahava was going with, that same understanding, that it was a definite. So Rav Ada bar Ahava Rav Yosef says, Amar Rav Yosef, Mina aminala. Where did I get this from? The Tanya, because it says in a Braita, Rabbi Eliezer Akapar Omer Lo Nechleku Beit Shammai Beit Hillel No Ladik Shum Mahul Shetzarich Latif Mimenu Dam Berit Alma Nechleku Lechalel Alav Shabbat Beit Shammai Omrim Machalin Alav Shabbat Ubeit Hillel Omrim En Machalin Alav Shabbat. So now, very interesting. So Rabbi Eliezer Akapar says like this, that everybody agrees that a child who is Nolad Mahul, that's born circumcised, requires Hatafat Dam Brit. You have to draw blood from him. What's the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel? Whether you violate Shabbat to do it. According to Beit Shammai, you violate Shabbat to do it. According to Beit Hillel, you don't. So Beit Shammai is saying it's a definite, right? Beit Hillel is saying it isn't.
Right.
Okay? Now, so how does that prove? How does that prove Rav Yosef's position? So he says, actually it seems to contradict it, because according to that, Rav Yosef is following Beit Shammai. Right? So lav miklal de Tana kama savar mechalelin alav et Shabbat. So what Rav Yosef is doing is he's inferring something from this Braita. This Braita says that Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar says Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel only argue about whether you do Chilul Shabbat. They don't argue about whether you need to do the Hataf Adam Brit. But that implies that there was a Tana Kama that had a different view. It's not written, but Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar is saying, no, the only thing they argued about whether to violate Shabbat for this or not. So Rav Yosef is saying, that must mean there was a Tana Kama who said, no, everybody agrees you violate Shabbat for it. And then Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar comes along and says, no, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued about whether to violate Shabbat for it. So Rav Yosef is inferring, in other words, from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar says,
they're establishing that
there was a hidden view. Right.
There was indeed a safek somewhere. Maybe they don't know exactly where.
Right, not a safek. In other words, Rav Yosef is saying that that from the fact that Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar is saying that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued about whether you can circumcise, or whatever you want to call it, a child that was born circumcised on Shabbat, means that the Tanakh Kama that Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar was responding to must have said that you're allowed to do it on Shabbat. And Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar says, no, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel argued about this. Beit Shammai was the one who says that you could do it, but Beit Hillel says no.
Right, so that makes it that there is a safek.
That not a safek, that Beit Hillel must have said that you could violate Shabbat for it, according to the first opinion. It's a machloket, not a safek. In other words, Rav Yosef is inferring that the Tanakh Kama was saying...
The machloket creates a safek.
Yeah, but we don't always say a safek, otherwise you'd never be able to do anything. So, in other words, if Beit Hillel, the Tanakh Kama is saying... Right, so Rav Yosef is saying that the Tanakh Kama must have said that Beit Hillel allows you to violate Shabbat to draw blood from the pre-circumcised child. Okay, because otherwise, why is Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar insisting that no, only Beit Shammai allowed you to do that, not Beit Hillel? So that's what he says. So then the Gemara says, wait, v'dil matana kama debrei kol in mechalelin kamar. Maybe you could say the opposite way. Maybe the Tanakh Kama said everybody says you can't violate Shabbat to draw blood from the child that was born circumcised, and Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar says no, it was a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Okay. So maybe it's even worse. Maybe according to the Tanakh Kama, nobody allows you to do it on Shabbat. So then the Gemara says no, because him ken Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar tamad Beit Shammai atalash ma'inan. Because that would make Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar coming along to tell you the position of Beit Shammai. Why would he do that? So you're telling me that the Tanakh Kama said that everyone says you cannot violate Shabbat to draw blood from this child that was born circumcised. And Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar interjects just to tell us what Beit Shammai said? That Beit Shammai says that actually you're allowed to? Why would he have to tell us that? The halakha doesn't follow Beit Shammai anyway. Yeah. Therefore, what must we assume? We must assume that the Tanakh Kama had said, the Tanakh Kama who's hidden here, he doesn't appear here, we're inferring what he said. We must infer that the Tanakh Kama said actually that everyone says you can violate Shabbat for this Nolad Mahul, and Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar was coming along to say, no, only Beit Shammai allows that, but actually Beit Hillel doesn't allow it. But the Tanakh Kama was saying that Beit Hillel did allow it. So Rav Yosef is saying, I can infer from this that according to the majority opinion, not Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, but according to the majority tradition of Beit Hillel, okay, a child that was born circumcised could have their blood drawn on Shabbat. Yeah, because Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar is coming along. Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar is coming along and saying that no, Beit Hillel says they can't. Only Beit Shammai allowed that. Yeah. Okay, so that's what he's trying to say. Everything is a safek. I mean, if you look at it that way. But the question,
why aren't they bringing the example of that God required Moshe to be circumcised, even though he was born Mahol, even though he was born?
Because it wasn't him; it was a child.
No, but Moshe was born circumcised.
According to the Midrash, but I mean, even if he was, the circumcision later is his child.
So the fact that
the one in Parashat Shemot, I mean, was his child. That was his child. She didn't circumcise him; she circumcised the baby.
Wasn't it Moses?
No, it was Eliezer. Yeah. So now the Gemara says, Dilma hachika amar. No, you can still say a different thing. That lo nechliku beit Shammai u beit Hillel b'davar zeh. Rav Yosef's position is not convincing, because we can go back and say that no, the Tanakh Kama said that the machloket was whether. In other words, it's not that the Tanakh Kama was more liberal and said that everyone agrees that the child that was born circumcised can have its blood drawn on Shabbat. It's that the Tanakh Kama said that the machloket between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai was whether you even need to draw blood from the child that was born circumcised. And Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar is coming along and saying, no, Beit Hillel says he does need to have his blood drawn. The question is whether you can violate Shabbat. But nobody holds that according to Beit Hillel you would violate Shabbat for it. According to the Tanakh Kama, Beit Hillel would say you don't even need to draw blood. And according to Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, yes, you have to draw blood, but you definitely wouldn't do it on Shabbat. So Rav Yosef's inference is not a solid inference. We can't. So Rav Yosef and Rabbah have a machloket in the end that there's no resolution of it whether you would do this blood drawing on Shabbat. No, it is a safek. That's why we don't do it.
Right.
In other words, yeah. But in the end, if we came up with a psikat halacha in the end, if we were to conclude that Rabbah was right, that Rav Yosef was right, that then even though there are other opinions, we wouldn't say it's a safek anymore, even though there are other opinions. Okay, so but we're saying that we don't know, so it's a safek. So therefore, we don't do it on Shabbat. Okay, now Amar Ravasi. So Ravasi says, "Kol she'imot tme'a leda," any child whose mother becomes tme'a leda. This is in the beginning of Parashat Tazria. Beginning of Parashat Tazria says, "Isha ki Tazria v'yaleda zachar v'tama'a shevat yamim." Okay, that a woman who is inseminated and has a boy becomes tme'ah, right? And then it says uvayom hashemini yimol bisar olato, and on the 8th day its flesh has to be circumcised, right? So what do you see? There's a connection between the tumat leda and the brit milah. So Avasi is saying any child whose mother becomes tme'ah leda becomes tme'ah, which means she didn't have a C-section. So her child is obligated to be circumcised on the 8th day, which means the circumcision overrides Shabbat. And so in other words, if a child is born from a C-section, we would not circumcise it on Shabbat. Let's say it's born on Shabbat through a C-section, emergency C-section on Shabbat. Baby comes out, so the woman is not tme'ah leda because she didn't have a normal birth. So what ends up happening is that the baby, even though its 8th day falls out on Shabbat, we would wait till Sunday.
Which means that if it was in Shabbat and you didn't do the circumcision, you would...
No, it just wouldn't have nimol lishmona. It doesn't have to be circumcised on the 8th day. It still needs to be circumcised.
Right, but the obligation to circumcise on the 8th day is lifted.
Right.
In other words, once you have a C-section...
That's what he's saying.
Yeah, okay.
That's what Ravasi is saying. And by the way, did I mention that according to us, both a convert and a baby that's born mahul, they both have to have hatafat dam brit for sure. That's what we say today, without a bracha, but that's what we do. Right? Yeah. So, but Ravasi is saying a different issue now. So, is there a case where another case where you wouldn't have this day 8 requirement? That if you don't have the day 8 requirement, you're not going to have the Shabbat requirement. Shenemar ishaki tazriya. So that's what he says. V'chol she'en imot me'al leda en imol lishmona. Shenemar ishaki tazriya v'yaleda zachar v'tama'a shevat yamim. That's what it says, okay? That's the rest of the pasuk. And then it's connected. Abai said to him, wait a second, that's not true. Because how could you say that? Did Avraham Avinu have Tumat Leda? Avraham Avinu observed Tumat Leda? No. Right? Did Yitzchak Avinu have Tumat Leda? No. That's something that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. You see from here that they weren't that literal about the whole thing about the Evod keeping all the mitzvot, right? Because otherwise that'd be, some Haredim would say this is heretical, because what does he mean? Of course, Yitzchak Avinu, he kept all the halachot, even muktzeh and everything. So how could it be? So anyway, now, so how could it be that Yitzchak Avinu had to be nimol lishmona, right? He had to be circumcised 8th day. Yaakov Avinu had to be circumcised 8th day when he was born, Yaakov and Esav and everybody. So there was no tumat leda, there was no impurity of birth, because that didn't exist. So how can you say that circumcising
didn't exist officially, but Avraham did keep.
Well, they could say that, but the point is, he's saying there was no obligation of tumat leda. So how could you connect? How could you connect? Right. So how could you connect the circumcision on the 8th day to impurity if the impurity didn't exist and they were circumcising on the 8th day? Answer: famous Talmudic saying, Amar le nitna Torah v'nitchadesha halacha. Let's return to Amud Bet. The Torah was given and the halakha was renewed. In other words, it's a new halakha that came at Matan Torah. True, in the times of the Avot, Brit Milat, 8 days was a separate obligation. But when the Torah was given, it became connected to Tumat Leda. It became connected to the childbirth Tum'ah. Is that really true? Because it was stated, Yotze Dofen u'mishesh lo shte orlot, that if there's a C-section, which, by the way, back then meant that the woman died because they didn't have a way to repair it.
They call that shte orlot?
No, yotze dofen. It comes out the side. Comes out of the wall. Coming out of the wall is yotze dofen. Right? Nowadays, yotze dofen means an exceptional case. Right? Yotze dofen, it means cesarean section. Yeah. Here, yotze dofen means something that goes it goes through the wall, literally through the wall of the stomach. So, or someone who has 2 foreskins. Either that means 2 foreskins with only one organ, or it means that he has 2 penises, which I guess would be a very unusual abnormality, but could happen. So, either way. Rav Huna v'Rav Chia bar Rav. There was a machloka between Rav Huna and Rav Chia bar Rav. Chad amar mechalin alav et Shabbat. Chad amar in mechalin. One says that you can violate Shabbat for the child who was C-section. The other one says, and the one that had 2 orlot, and the other one says you cannot. Okay. So ad kan lo pligei ela lechalel alav et Shabbat avalishmona vaday ma'alinan le. So how could you tell me? Wait a second. You're telling me that you only circumcise on the 8th day if the mother was Tme'ah Leda. Now, the double orla case is not significant, but the C-section case, you just told me that you wouldn't circumcise on the 8th day. But it's telling you here, the machloket is, do you violate Shabbat for the baby or not? In other words, when you do the circumcision. But the implication is that 8th day circumcision is required. So he answered, one is connected to the other. In other words, the machloket between Rav Huna and Rav Chia bar Rav is the same machloket. If they're arguing there about whether you violate Shabbat to circumcise the child, then ipso facto, by definition, they're arguing whether the child must be circumcised on the 8th day or not. Because if it must be circumcised on the 8th day, then that means that the circumcision overrides Shabbat. And if it need not be circumcised on the 8th day, that's exactly when it won't be circumcised on Shabbat. So in other words, the position here that's saying that you don't violate Shabbat for this child is because it's not required to be circumcised on the 8th day, and that's because that's following Rav Asi's position. That since the mother is not Tme'ah Leda, in the case of the C-section, therefore the Brit Milad does not have to take place on the 8th day, and therefore it can't override Shabbat.
But the bottom line is that the argument is the same, whether she's Tme'ah Leda that argument is only made to know whether it's an obligation or not.
Right. The child definitely needs to be circumcised. The question is, does it have to be circumcised the 8th day or not? Right. And therefore, and only a child who must be circumcised, think about it this way, only a child who must be circumcised on that day can be circumcised on Shabbat. Right? So if it's not for the fact that it must be circumcised on the 8th day and the 8th day falls out on Shabbat, you would never think of doing a circumcision.
The only thing they're arguing about is whether it's from the fact of Tme'ah Leda or not.
Right, whether it's connected or not, right. And incidentally, that's what we say. We say that a C-section baby that's born on Shabbat is not circumcised on Shabbat. We circumcise it on Sunday.
Does that mean that the mother is not Tme'ah? Like, in other words,
well, if she bleeds, I guess she would be, but not the biblical status of Tumat Leda.
In other words, the only thing that considered a woman Tme'ah Leda is if there's vaginal bleeding.
Yeah, but I don't know what happens in a C-section. My wife never had one, but I don't know exactly how it works. I'm sure there must be some bleeding.
But if in a C-section there is no vaginal bleeding, then
there wouldn't be any. It wouldn't be the normal Tumah case. Yeah. Now, or for example, like the real application would be like I'm assuming there's going to be bleeding. Just because of the body, just because of the trauma, there's going to be some bleeding.
Right.
But I would guess that, like for example, if you have a girl, there's a 14-day nidah. Right. So if the baby is born vaginally, but if the baby is born C-section and the woman bleeds some but doesn't bleed, let's say more than a few days, so then she wouldn't have to wait the full 14 days.
So it's the
right?
amount of time.
Yeah, it might affect that. Now normally it doesn't make a difference because she's bleeding anyway for a while after the birth, so it doesn't really. And we don't rely on the biblical idea of dam tohar that would allow you to ignore it after a certain point. So yeah, you just have to wait. So you end up waiting anyway. So I don't know how long the bleeding would persist in this case. So but anyway. This is actually a Tanaitic dispute. It's actually a dispute among Tanaim whether the mitzvah of Brit Milan on the 8th day is connected intrinsically to Tumat Leda or not, to the impurity of birth. So we're going to see that. Yesh. Now what we need to know is there are two types of slaves in the Torah. One is called a Miknat Kesef, and one is called the Yilid Bayit. You'll know from when Avraham Avinu was told the mitzvah of Brit Milah, he's told Yilid Bayit umiknat kesef mikol ben nechar, that whether it's a Yilid Bayit, a slave born in the house, in other words, they're already part of the family, or you acquire the slave, they have to be circumcised. You can't have a non-circumcised person part of your family. And even the Avadim are considered part of your family structure. They're part of the group. So now the Gemara says, quotes a Baraita, Yesh Yilid Bayit Shnimol Le'echad. Some children, slave children born in the house, are Nimolim on the first day. V'yesh Yilid Bayit Shnimol Lishmona. And some you wait till the 8th day. Yesh Miknat Kesef Shnimol Le'echad, Yesh Miknat Kesef Shnimol Lishmona. Similarly, there are some cases where a Miknat Kesef, where a purchased slave will be circumcised the day you purchase him, even if he's 1 day old, and sometimes you'll wait till 8 days. Okay. Now Rashi explains that this is because it says the concept of circumcision of slaves twice, and in one case it's linked to the circumcision of regular Jews as 8th day, and in another case it's said separately. So in the case that it's said separately, it implies that it's an immediate, not waiting till the 8th day. And the case where it's connected to the circumcision of regular Jews, the implication is it should be 8th day. So there are two categories. So how does it work? So now the Baraita is going to flesh this out. So yesh miknat kesef shnimol le'echad.
Either way,
you still
have the same issue because you could be born on Shabbat and then you.
Right. We're going to see. So yesh miknat kesef shnimol le'echad, yesh miknat kesef shnimol le'shmona. So ketzad. How does it work? What are the cases here? Lakach shivcha me'oberet v'achar kach yalada. Zeu miknat kesef shnimol le'shmona. You purchased a female maidservant who was pregnant. So when she gives birth, she's already under your domain. So since the birth happens under your domain, you wait for the 8th day. Okay, you purchased her when she was already pregnant, though. Right. So lakach shivcha uvlada ima zoi miknat kesef shnimol le'echad. If you purchased a maidservant who had just given birth yesterday, and you purchased her and the baby, so then the baby could be immediately circumcised. It doesn't mean you have to, but in other words, it's immediately circumcisable. You don't wait till the 8th day.
There's no obligation to do it.
Right.
Okay.
So, in other words, you can do it right. You could do it right away, because, like in hospital circumcision, right? You could do hospital circumcision because you don't need to wait to the 8th day because the birth didn't happen under your domain. Okay, the birth happened yesterday. It's 1 day old baby,
and therefore the baby is not considered.
It wasn't born under your domain. Well, the baby has to become Jewish anyway through converting because it's a Kanani, it's an Eved Kanani. So if the woman was purchased before and then had the baby. So the birth happened under your domain. So then you wait for 8 days. If the birth happened the day before and then you purchased the woman and the baby, even though it's 1 day old, you can immediately circumcise the baby because the only time where you wait for 8 days is when it's similar to lachem. It's similar to your own circumcision of so meaning it happened under Jewish auspices. The birth. When the birth happened under Jewish auspices.
So then why is it that day? Why not? Well, you can do it any time.
Basically, that's what it means.
Oh, in other words, you could wait.
Right. I guess you could wait. I don't know that it means it has to be immediate.
In other words, they're not saying, okay, you have to do it before
that day. Right.
What they're saying is that you can do it any time.
Nimol le'echad sounds like it means you can do it immediately. You can do it immediately.
You can do it immediately.
Yeah. So, so what's the case of the one who's born in the house, whom you circumcise at 8 days? If you purchased the maidservant and she wasn't pregnant, that's the Yilid Bayit. In other words, Miknat Kesef includes when you purchase her with the child or when you purchase her already pregnant. Yilid Bayit means she became pregnant under your auspices. Okay? That's Miknat Kesef. So then, in Miknat Kesef, it matters if she gave birth under your auspices. And with Yilid Bayit, that's when she became pregnant under your auspices and gave birth. That's going to be always Shmona. According to the Tanakama, if she became pregnant under your auspices, you bought her today and she became pregnant today, that child is going to be 8 days circumcised. However, Rabbi, according to some, and Rav, according to others, Rav Chama Omer, Yaleda v'achar kach hitbila, zeu yilid bayit shnimo le'echad. Hitbila v'achar kach yaleda, zeu yilid bayit hanimo le'shmona. According to Rav Chama, it works like this. You purchase the maidservant, and remember, you have to bring her to the mikveh. You have to make her Jewish, basically. She becomes Jewish when you purchase her. So you purchase the woman, now you have to bring her to the mikveh. If she gave birth, she becomes pregnant and she gives birth before you have a chance to arrange for the mikveh, that is nimol le'echad. Okay, that's going to be a child that's circumcised on the first day, even though you purchased her first. In other words, she's under your auspices, and the woman became pregnant under your auspices, and she gave birth under your auspices. Since she hadn't gone to the mikveh yet, it's still only nimol le'echad. You still do the circumcision on the first day, meaning there's no requirement of 8th day. If she had gone to the mikveh before the birth, now you circumcise at 8 days. So this is a machloket between Rav Chama and the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama said, if the pregnancy started, or even the birth happened after she was under your auspices, certainly if the pregnancy started once she was under your auspices, in other words, you had purchased her, then it's 8-day circumcision. According to Rav Chama, she has to have gone to the mikveh before the birth happened, not just be under your auspices.
You have to already be
Jewish. Right, so what does that show you? That shows you that according to Rav Chama, she has to be Tamei Leda. In other words, he's holding like what Rav Asi said before, that in order to have the obligation of 8th day circumcision, the child has to have, or the mother has to have been Tamei Leda. And if the woman is not Jewish, right, if the woman is not Jewish,
purchasing her does not automatically make her Jewish.
Right.
She still has to
become Jewish. Right, so that it makes sense according to Rav Acha, because according to Rav Chama, because Rav Chama is saying that she has to be Jewish and be Tmei Leda as a result of the birth. Okay, according to the Tanna Kama, it's Jewish auspices that determines it. Okay, she doesn't have to be Jewish herself yet. All right, so that's the way that the Tanna Kama is going. So v'Tanna Kama lo shanei le ben itbila v'achar kach yelada ben yelada v'achar kach itbila da'afagav de'en nimot me'aleda nimol lishmona. So what you see from that is that according to the Tanna Kama, whether or not she is Tmei Leda, whether or not she becomes impure from the birth, because she won't become impure from the birth if she's not Jewish. Right? So still you circumcise a child at 8 days. So it's a machloket Tanaim, basically. But then the Gemara has a problem. But Bishla Mala Rabbi Chama. So according to Rabbi Chama, we have Mishkachat La, Yilid Bait Nimol Le'echad, Yilid Bait Nimol Lechet, Miknat Kesef Nimol Le'echad, Miknat Kesef Nimol Lechet. Because now you have all 4 cases according to Rabbi Chama. You have all 4 cases. Why? Because if she gave birth and then she went to the mikveh, that's a case where the child was born under Jewish auspices, but doesn't have to wait till 8 days because she gave birth before she went to the mikveh. Okay? Similarly, if she went to the mikveh first and then gave birth, that's a case where the circumcision takes place on the 8th day. That if he purchases that in a case of purchasing the pregnant girl, okay, he purchased the pregnant girl and then she went to the mikveh while she was pregnant and then gave birth. That's a case where she's going to, even though the pregnancy didn't happen under Jewish auspices, she was Jewish when she gave birth, so that's miknat kesef. She was purchased as a pregnant slave, but the birth happened when she was already Jewish, so it's good. Okay, it's an 8-day situation, and then that's miknat. But then you have. And you can have a case where she was purchased pregnant, but the baby would still be nimol on the first day. And what's that case? That's a case where one person purchased the maidservant and one person purchased the baby. Okay? So the baby was purchased separately from the baby. They were separated. So therefore, since it's not lachem, since it's not a normal situation, similar to a Jewish birth, where the mother and the child are both under the same auspices, since the mother's under one auspices and the child is under another one, therefore it's going to be nimol le'echad. It's going to be not nimol lishmona. It's not going to have the circumcision on the 8th day. Now the Mefarshim explained that there would have been a simpler case here. The simpler case is that he purchased her while she was pregnant, and he didn't have a chance to take her to the mikveh before she gave birth. Because Rav Chama will also say that that's only nimol echad, it's nimol the first day. Right? So there are different girsaot here. There are different versions of the text. Some of them have that case too. Okay, some of them have the cases a little bit differently. Because you don't need these cases the way that they are. There were multiple cases actually that Rav Chama could use. The only what's the problem though? The problem is really Ela Tanakama, because Rav Chama has multiple cases that he could fit into the two rubrics. Because the real issue for him did she go to the mikveh yet or not? That's the only case for him. The only case that you have difficulty finding for the Tanakama is Yilid Bayit. Since Yilid Bayit means that she became pregnant when she was already owned by the Jew. She was already under Jewish auspices. So how could there, and since the Tanakama doesn't care about going to the mikveh or not, so how could you have a case where the pregnancy takes place, or starts, the conception takes place under Jewish auspices, but the baby is not going to be circumcised at 8 days? There won't be such a case.
Yeah,
because the mikveh doesn't matter. The mikveh doesn't matter to the Tanakama. As long as the conception took place when she was under Jewish auspices, even if she didn't go to the mikveh before the birth, she's still going to circumcise the child at 8 days. So where's the case where she was where the conception happened under Jewish auspices, but he's not circumcised at 8 days? So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, "Bilokech shivcha le'ubara." Maybe it's talking about a case where you purchased the shivcha, but you said, "I don't really want the shivcha. I don't want the maidservant. I just want her offspring." Okay, so you purchased basically the baby independently of the mother. And therefore, according to the Tanakama, the baby is under Jewish auspices, but the mother is not. So when the baby comes out, it's going to be nimol le'echad. It's going to be circumcised even on the first day, not on the 8th day, because since he didn't own both the mother and the child, therefore it's not a case that's similar to a normal Jewish case, and it has to be similar to a normal Jewish case to justify the 8th day circumcision.
In the law of conversion, if a baby is conceived from a mother who's not Jewish, and before she gives birth, she's
go to the mikveh, it's Jewish.
The baby is Jewish.
Yeah, that is true.
Okay.
So hanicha leman damar kinyan perot lav kikinyan aguf dame. Eleman damar kinyan perot kikinyan aguf dame ma'ika lememar. That makes sense according to the opinion that says that if you purchase something and you say, I don't want the thing, I just want its production, I just want what it produces. So one opinion says that fine, you don't own the thing, you only own the offspring, or you only own what it generates. But what about the opinion that says that purchasing the offspring of something is the same as purchasing the thing? So therefore, if you say, I'm purchasing this maidservant, but only for the children she produces, I'm not purchasing her. So according to that view, you're still basically purchasing the maidservant, and therefore she's still basically under Jewish auspices, and it's still the same as any other member of the household having a child. So it should be still 8th. So therefore the Gemara says, so therefore Amar Rav Misharshia says, Belokeach shivcha al menat shelo lahatbila. That we're talking about a case where you purchase the maidservant with the explicit intention, I'm not going to take her to the mikveh. I'm not going to take her to immerse her. And Rashi says, that mitzvot don't apply to her at all, because it's not like lachem. Lachem is the mitzvah when Hashem says to Abraham, you have to circumcise lachem for yourselves. So whenever we apply the 8-day rule, it's always because the situation is similar to a Jewish situation. It's like part of the Jewish family. But in a case where you say explicitly, I'm not going to immerse you at all, so it's really excluding the mother from the household. So even though you purchase the mother, so she's under Jewish auspices, and she becomes pregnant under Jewish auspices, but since you purchased her from the beginning saying, I'm not going to immerse this maidservant, I'm not going to, right, so he's going to have to let her go eventually, but he's not going to do it. So that's basically removing her from the category of lachem. She's not really becoming part of the household fully, and therefore when she gives birth, it's nimol le'echad. So Rashi says, so it's not about tumat leda. It's not because the Tanakama requires that the birth be produced tum'ah. It's that what he's concerned about is whether it's under Jewish auspices or not. And if you purchase her on the condition that you're not going to immerse her, that's basically saying that you're going to she's not really becoming part of the household. Now Tosafot says, we say, you can keep her around for a while. eventually you're going to have to release her if you do it on the condition not to convert her, but you can keep her around for a while. So she's not fully integrated. So since she's not fully integrated, that's why it's not nimolachet. It's not, the baby is not going to be circumcised at 8 days, but circumcised at 1 day. So, but you have a grace period, but fundamentally you have a machloket here. Does a birth, in order to justify the child being circumcised at 8 days, does the birth have to happen, have to create childbirth tum'ah or not? And basically the practical halacha is that we do follow that position because we say that a cesarean section baby will not be nimol lishmona, meaning we will circumcise the child on the 8th day. But if it falls out on Shabbat, we will not override Shabbat for the circumcision of the child.